Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope, which is the second book in a series of his that doesn't need to be read as a series, that takes place in and around or connected with the cathedral town of Barchester. And in the first book in the series, The Warden, a new arrival in town, a medical man named John Bold, draws everyone's attention, including the attention of the newspapers, to the fact that a charitable hospital is being run by a warden who is drawing almost £1,000 a year, a staggering salary for doing essentially nothing, while the 12 men who are living in that beadsman's hospital get shillings a day, if that. Those old men have always counted themselves fortunate. They've had lovely grounds, a saintly man to look after their needs, spiritual and otherwise, and no cares. They are taught greed by the rabble-rousing of John Bold, who tells them that they should be getting a lot of money. They should be getting a lot more money from the proceeds of this hospital. And it causes a furor in the papers that causes the warden, Mr. Harding, to resign. He's a gentle, retiring man who cannot bear to have his name in the papers. And the struggle over that hospital and the warden's position in it and whatnot goes on for the length of the book called The Warden. Because although Mr. Harding cannot stand the idea of notoriety and is willing to sacrifice his position to avoid it, the Archdeacon of Barchester, Dr. Grantley, who is also Mr. Harding's son-in-law, is not willing to yield. He thinks it's a foolish idea to give up your position merely for a little bit of controversy in the press. So we get a little bit of a tempest in a teacup in The Warden. And at the end of that book, Mr. Harding has a small living, at a church, a much smaller, much less lucrative church. He lives in lodgings over a chemist's shop instead of in his beautiful house. And more importantly, as that novel ends, we are told that the charitable hospital has fallen into desuetude, that it is, as the beadsmen die, they are not replaced, and no one is taking any control over it. And so we get the feeling in The Warden that all of it was for nothing, that all that signified nothing. In Barchester Towers, we learned that Parliament has taken up the issue. John Bold has since died and left a wealthy widow and a little baby. But Parliament takes up the issue and debates it and institutes a new regime. There will be a warden at the hospital, although the warden will he will make half what he was making before. But there will still be a charity in Barchester. 12 vagrant men will live there, and there'll be a new charitable hospital for 12 vagrant women, and it will have a matron. And that naturally raises the question of who will be warden of Hiram's Hospital. The same question that was all over the first book suddenly becomes important in this book. Who will be warden? Everyone in Barchester assumes it will be Mr. Harding, the old warden. They loved him in that position, and he is beloved anyway. And that would probably have happened as a matter of course, but there's a new broom in Barchester. In between the first book and the second book, the very beginning of the second book, the old Bishop of Barchester dies, and a newcomer is put in place, a stranger to Barchester. Mr. Prouty and his wife, Mrs. Prouty, and his personal chaplain, Mr. Slope. And they immediately want to bring the diocese to heel. It's pretty clear, Trollope makes it pretty clear, that they don't have any strong religious reasons for doing that. They mainly just want to control things and not have any upstarts. And Dr. Grantley absolutely is an upstart, immediately recognizes these people, especially Mr. Slope, as his enemy, and sets about campaigning to get Mr. Harding, who is his father-in-law, back into the hospital, back into running the hospital. And the larger ecclesiastical war that's going on here between Mrs. Prouty and Mr. Slope and the Grantleyite faction is the broader subject of this book, plus the final fate of that rich widow, Eleanor Bold. But at the center of that larger war is Hiram's Hospital. It is the same subject that we dealt with in the first book. which is who will take control of it. Mrs. Prouty wants to bring Barchester under her thumb, and she recognizes accurately that the right way to do that is to make everyone beholden to her. The wardenship of Hiram's Hospital is a wealthy place. It's in her husband's gift, and her husband, as we're told, is thoroughly henpecked. She decides that she can award that wardenship, but she doesn't want it to go to Mr. Harding, who is the father-in-law of her husband's worst enemy. So she chooses someone else, a Mr. Quiverful, who's a very well-meaning but sort of non-entity young curate or older curate who has 14 living children. So he's very, very poor. He's not making any money, anywhere near enough money to support all his children. In the chapter that we're going to read today, we're told that he can't even have all his children go to church at the same time because there aren't enough socks and shoes to go around. So, complete poverty. Mrs. Prouty thinks not only will it benefit him and his wife and his children, which is partly on her mind, but not very much, but he'll be unbelievably grateful. Like a whipped dog. He will never think of disobeying her orders. So she pretty much lets Mrs. Quiverful know that the position is assured. Even though it's not technically Mrs. Prouty's to give, it's her husband's. Her husband is the bishop. In the meantime, Mr. Slope has conceived of a plan to woo and wed Eleanor Bold, specifically for her wealth. Because he thinks it would be a nice thing to have a wife who's not only beautiful, Eleanor Bold is beautiful, but also has £1,200 a year, free and clear of her own, that would become her husband's if he married her. And Mr. Slope realizes in his canny kind of way that he would be improving his position with Eleanor Bold if he worked to get Eleanor's father, Mr. Harding, back in the job of warden, a job he loves and misses. But this puts him in opposition to Mrs. Prouty. And that is another little splinter war that's taking place in this book. And that's where we are when we get to our present chapter, chapter 24, which brings Mr. Slope back into the action. We had to first meet Mr. Arabin, who Archdeacon Grantley has brought into the fold in order specifically to fight Mr. Slope. And we also spent time meeting the Thorns of Ullathorne, the local landed gentry. And we also met their house. Enormous land. But now Mr. Slope is re-entering the picture. Eventually, in this chapter, he will re-enter the picture. This is chapter 24. Mr. Slope manages matters very cleverly at Puddingdale. Puddingdale is the seat right now of Mr. Quiverful and his family. That's the little church that he runs, with not enough money to live on. I think we're told that he makes something like £400 a year for 14 children. Anyway, in the scene where this chapter takes place, Eleanor Bold and her father-in-law, Mr. Harding, have gone out to Plumstead Episcopi to spend a nice quiet month in the household of Dr. Grantley, and another guest is Mr. Arabin. They are all there for this whole time. The next 2 weeks passed pleasantly enough at Plumstead. The whole party there assembled seemed to get on well together. Eleanor made the house agreeable, and the Archdeacon and Mr. Grantley seemed to have forgotten her iniquity as regarded Mr. Slope. Mr. Harding had his cello played to them while his daughter accompanied him. Johnny Bold, that's the little baby, by the help of either Mr. Rarechild or else by that of his coral and carrot juice, got through his teething troubles. There had been gaieties, too, of all sorts. They had dined at Ullathorne, and the Thorns had dined at the rectory. Eleanor had been duly put to stand on her box, and in that position had found herself quite unable to express her opinion on the merits of flounces, such having been the subject given to try her elocution. Remember we said in an earlier chapter, they're in a carriage together, and Mr. Arabin is talking about how nervous he is to speak for the first time to his new congregation. And Dr. Grantley is teasing him for that, because Dr. Grantley is a stranger to being nervous of any kind. And at one point during that conversation, the sort of funny raillery idea comes up that maybe Eleanor should try it if she's so sure that it wouldn't matter. Maybe she should try standing on a box and talking to intimate friends on some subject. She would find that she fumbled. And Trollope refers to that whole scene as an argument. I said at the time, it's easy to read it as though it were all done with laughter, but it seems like it's funny. And here we see that it is funny. It must have been. because they do make Eleanor stand up on a box in friendly company and discourse on a subject, and she can't do it. So you could that's called gaiety here because that's what it was. Uh, anyway, Mr. Arabin had, of course, been much in his own parish, looking at the doings of his vicarage, calling on his parishioners, and taking on himself the duties of his new calling. But still he had been every evening at Plumstead, and Mrs. Grantley was partly willing to agree with her husband that he was a pleasant inmate in a house. They had also been at a dinner party at the Stanhopes, of which Mr. Arabin had made one. He also, moth-like, burned his wings in the flames of the Signora's candle, that is, Madeline Vesey Stanhope, who is a seductress. Like her siblings, she was raised in Italy, not in England. The Stanhopes have recently been called back to Barchester, but she is a seductress, and very intentionally. She's the opposite of Eleanor Bold. Eleanor Bold is not even aware of how beautiful she is, whereas the Signora, she knows and uses it. Let's see here. Anyway, let's go back. Mrs. Bold, too, had been there and had felt somewhat displeased with the want of taste, she called it, shown by Mr. Arabin in paying so much attention to Madame Neroni. It was as infallible that Madeline should displease and irritate the women as that she should charm and captivate the men. The one result followed naturally on the other. It was quite true that Mr. Arabin had been charmed. He thought her a very clever and a very handsome woman. He thought also that her peculiar affliction entitled her to the sympathy of all. She's lame. She can't walk. She lays herself on a couch when people come to visit. He had never, he said, met so much suffering joined to such perfect beauty and so clear a mind. 'Twas thus he spoke of the Signora coming home in the Archdeacon's carriage, and Eleanor by no means liked to hear the praise. It was, however, exceedingly unjust of her to be angry with Mr. Arabin, as she had herself spent a very pleasant evening with Bertie Stanhope, who had taken her down to dinner and had not left her side for one moment after the gentleman came out of the dining room. It was unfair that she should amuse herself with Bertie and yet begrudge her new friend his license of amusing himself with Bertie's sister. And yet she did so. She was half angry with him in the carriage and said nothing about the meretricious manners Mr. Arabin did not understand the ways of women very well, or else he might have flattered himself that Eleanor was in love with him. But Eleanor was not in love with him. How many shades there are between love and indifference, and how little the graduated scale is understood. She now had been nearly 3 weeks in the same house with Mr. Arabin, and had received much of his attention, and listened daily to his conversation. He had usually devoted at least some portion of his evening to her exclusively. At Dr. Stanhope's, he had devoted himself exclusively to another. It does not require that a woman should be in love to be irritated by this. It doesn't require that she should even acknowledge to herself that it is unpleasant to her. If it doesn't require that a woman be in love to be irritated by that, then what does explain that? This is just Trollope being Trollope. Eleanor had no such self-knowledge. She thought in her own heart that it was only on Mr. Arabin's account that she regretted that he could condescend to be amused by the Signora. I thought he had more mind, she said to herself, as she sat watching her baby's cradle on her return from the party. After all, I believe Mr. Stanhope is the pleasanter man of the two. Alas for the memory of poor John Bold. That's her dead husband. Eleanor was not in love with Bertie Stanhope, nor was she in love with Mr. Arabin, but her devotion to her late husband was fast fading, when she could revolve in her mind over the cradle of his infant the faults and failings of other aspirants to her favor. Will any one of us blame my heroine for this? Let him, or rather her, thank God of all his goodness. Eleanor, in truth, was not in love. Neither was Mr. Arabin. Neither, indeed, was Bertie Stanhope, though he had already found occasion to say nearly as much as that he was. Because he, like Mr. Slope, wants to woo Eleanor for money. The widow's cap had prevented him from making a positive declaration, when otherwise he would have considered himself entitled to do so on the third or fourth interview. It was, after all, but a small cap now, and had but little of the weeping willow left in its construction. It is singular how these emblems of grief fade away by unseen gradations. Each pretends to be the counterpart of the forerunner, yet the last bit of crimped white crape that sits so jauntily on the back of the head is as dissimilar to the first huge mountain of woe which disfigures the face of the weeper as the state of the Hindu is to the jointure of an English dowager. Trollope commenting on women's fashion. Gotta love it. But let it be clearly understood that Eleanor was in love with no one, and that no one was in love with Eleanor. Under these circumstances, her anger against Mr. Arabin did not long last, and before 2 days were over, they were both as good of friends as ever. She could not but like him, for every hour spent in his company was spent pleasantly, and yet she could not quite like him, for there was always apparent in his conversation a certain feeling on his part that he hardly thought it worth his while to be earnest. It was almost as though he were playing with a child, and remember, we've been told that Mr. Arabin largely views women as children. She knew well enough that he was in truth a sober, thoughtful man, who in some matters and on some occasions could endure an agony of earnestness, and yet to her he was always gently playful. Could she have seen his brow once clouded, she might have learned to love him. I want to point out here that Trollope is incorrect. We have seen a scene in which Mr. Arabin is airing the deepest doubts and conflicts of his religious nature directly to Eleanor alone in private. She has seen him that way. If it happened once. Anyway, so things went on at Plumstead, and on the whole not unpleasantly, till a huge storm darkened the horizon and came down upon the inhabitants of that rectory with all the fury of a waterspout. It was astonishing how in a few minutes the whole face of the heavens was changed. The party broke up from breakfast in perfect harmony, but fierce passions had arisen before the evening, which did not admit of their sitting at the same board for dinner. To explain this, it will be necessary to go back a little. It will be remembered that the bishop expressed to Mr. Slope in his dressing room his determination that Mr. Quiverful should be confirmed in his appointment to the hospital, and that his lordship requested Mr. Slope to communicate this decision to the Archdeacon. That is also Mrs. Proudie's decision. It will also be remembered that the Archdeacon had indignantly declined seeing Mr. Slope, and had instead written a strong letter to the bishop, in which he all but demanded the situation of warden for Mr. Harding. To this letter the Archdeacon received an immediate formal reply from Mr. Slope, in which it was stated that the bishop had received and would give his best consideration to the Archdeacon's letter. This is baffling. The Archdeacon of Barchester being refused even a direct response from the bishop on a pressing matter. This is baffling. The Archdeacon himself felt somewhat checkmate by this reply. What could he do with a man who would neither see him nor argue with him by letter, and who had undoubtedly had the power of appointing any clergyman he pleased? He had consulted with Mr. Arabin, who had suggested the propriety of calling in the aid of the Master of Lazarus, that's Lazarus College at Oxford. If, said he, you and Dr. Gwynne formally declare your intention of waiting upon the bishop, and the bishop will not dare to refuse to see you. If two such men as you see him together, you will probably not leave without carrying your point. The point being that Mr. Harding should be made warden. The Archdeacon did not quite like admitting the necessity of his being backed by the Master of Lazarus before he could obtain open admission into the episcopal palace of Barchester. The old bishop was his friend. But he still felt the advice was good, and he resolved to take it. He wrote again to the bishop, expressing a hope that nothing further would be done in the matter of the hospital till the consideration promised by his lordship had been given. And then he sent off a warm appeal to his friend the master, imploring him to come to Plumstead and assist in driving the bishop into compliance. The master had rejoined, raising some difficulty, but not declining, and the Archdeacon had again pressed his point, insisting on the necessity for immediate action. Dr. Gwynne unfortunately had the gout, and could therefore name no immediate day, but still agreed to come if it should be finally found necessary. So the matter stood as regarded the party at Plumstead. The master has gout, urosepticemia. Very painful, and you don't want to go traveling on English roads. But Mr. Harding had another friend fighting his battle for him, quite as powerful as the Master of Lazarus, and this was Mr. Slope. Though the bishop had so pertinaciously insisted on giving way to his wife in the matter of the hospital, Mr. Slope did not think it necessary to abandon his object. He had, he thought, daily more and more reason to imagine that the widow would receive his overtures favorably, and he could not but feel that Mr. Harding at the hospital, and placed there by his means, would be more likely to receive him as son-in-law than Mr. Harding growling in opposition and disappointment under the Archdeacon's wing at Plumstead. I want to keep in mind here that Mr. Slope has had absolutely no indication, let alone more indications day by day. Eleanor, we are told, is as innocent as a baby. She does not know not only that Mr. Slope intends to marry her, but that anyone thinks that he does, when everyone at Plumstead knows this. So Eleanor joins the ranks of Trollope's dumb heroines. There are quite a few of them, unfortunately. The best thing, the nice thing, the only thing that saves his ability to craft a absolutely glowingly stupid heroine is his ability to craft incredible female characters who aren't stupid. We just have to remember that when we get a goose like this. uh, but I've lost my place again because I love to lecture. Moreover, to give Mr. Slope due credit, he was actuated by greater motives even than these. He wanted a wife, and he wanted money, but he wanted power more than either. And Trollope never fails. The minute he says that he's giving Mr. Slope credit, he makes him look worse. He had fully realized the fact that he must come to blows with Mrs. Proudie. He had no desire to remain in Barchester as her chaplain. Sooner than do so, he would risk the loss of his whole connection with the diocese. What? Was he to feel within himself the possession of no ordinary talents? Was he to know himself to be courageous, firm, and, in matters where his conscience did not interfere, unscrupulous, and yet be contented to be the working factotum of a woman prelate? You gotta love that little dig. That little dig there. At firm and in matters where his conscience did not interfere, unscrupulous. Mr. Slope had higher ideas of his own destiny. Either he or Mrs. Proudie must go to the wall, and now had come the time when he should try which it should be. The bishop had declared that Mr. Quiverful should be the new warden. As Mr. Slope went downstairs, prepared to see the archdeacon if necessary, but fully satisfied that no such necessity would arise, he declared to himself that Mr. Harding would be the warden. With the object of carrying this point, he rode over to Puddingdale, which is the place of Mr. Quiverful. He is not riding over to Puddingdale in order to tell Mr. Quiverful, the bishop has unequivocally told me you will get the position. He's riding over there to tell Mr. Quiverful the exact opposite of what he's been told to do. With the object of carrying this point, he rode over to Puddingdale and had a further interview with the worthy expectant of clerical goods. Mr. Quiverful was on the whole a worthy man. The impossible task of bringing up as ladies and gentlemen 14 children on an income which was insufficient to give them with decency the common necessities of life had had an effect on him not beneficial either to his spirit or his keen sense of honor. Who can boast that he would have supported such a burden with a different result? Mr. Quiverful was an honest, painstaking, drudging man, anxious indeed for bread and meat, anxious for means to quiet his butcher and cover with returning smiles the now sour countenance of his baker's wife, but anxious also to be right in his own conscience. He was not careful, as another might be who sat on an easier world seat, to stand well with those around him, to shun breath which might sully his name, or a rumor which might affect his humor. He could not afford such niceties of conduct, such moral luxuries. It must suffice for him to be ordinarily honest, according to the ordinary honesty of the world's ways, and to let men's tongues wag as they would. He felt that his brother clergyman, whom he had known for the last 20 years, looked coldly on him from the first moment that he had shown himself willing to sit at the feet of Mr. Slope. His brother clergymen hate Mr. Slope. But they have houses. They have incomes. They can afford to hate Mr. Slope, is what Trollope is saying here. He had seen their looks grow colder still when it had become bruited about that he was to be the bishop's new warden at Hiram's Hospital. This was painful enough, but it was cross he was doomed to bear. He thought of his wife, whose last new silk dress was 6 years in wear. He thought of all his young flock, whom he could hardly take to church with him on Sundays, for there were not decent shoes and stockings for all of them to wear. He thought of the well-worn sleeves of his own black coat, and of the stern face of the draper, from whom he would fain ask for cloth to make another, did he not know that the credit would be refused him. Then he thought of the comfortable house in Barchester, of the comfortable income, of his boys sent to school, of his girls with books in their hands instead of darning needles, of his wife's face again covered with smiles, and of his daily board again covered with plenty. He thought of these things, and do thou also, reader, think of them, and then wonder, if thou canst, that Mr. Slope had appeared to him as to possess all those good gifts which should grace a bishop's chaplain. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him that bringeth good tidings. A little quote from Isaiah there, a little quote from the Bible. Well, the point here is that this is a sympathetic portrait of Mr. Quiverful. He's not grasping for money. And he doesn't want to harm his friend, Mr. Harding, from whom he has had as much good things as he can expect. Now, that is ridiculous, of course. In practical terms, that is ridiculous. Mr. Harding could easily have given Mr. Quiverful and his family £200 a year. Wouldn't have hurt his standing, wouldn't have hurt his comfort at all, and it would have made a huge amount of difference to the Quiverfuls, and Harding must know that. He could have given them £200 a year. Just here's a gift. I'm sending over a basket of apples and also an envelope with £200 in it. He didn't do that, ever. Not once. So, but anyway. Why, moreover, should the Barchester clergy have looked coldly on Mr. Quiverful? Had not they all shown that they regarded with complacency the loaves and fishes of their mother church? Had they not all, by some hook or crook, done better for themselves than he had done? They were not burdened as he was burdened. Dr. Grantley had 5 children, and nearly as many thousands a year on which to feed them. It was very well for him to turn up his nose at a new bishop who could do nothing for him, and a chaplain who was beneath his notice. But it was cruel in a man so circumstanced to set the world against the father of 14 children because he was anxious to obtain for them an honorable support. He, Mr. Quiverful, had not asked for the wardenship. He had not even accepted it till he had been assured that Mr. Harding had refused it. How hard, then, should he be blamed for doing that which not to have done would have been argued the most insane imprudence? Absolutely true. This is not Trollope being ironic. It's absolutely true. Quiverful is in a horrible position. Thus, in the matter of the hospital, poor Mr. Quiverful had his trials, and he also had his consolations. On the whole, the consolations were the more vivid of the two. The stern draper heard of the coming promotion, and the wealth of his warehouse was at Mr. Quiverful's disposal, because Mrs. Proudie has made it clear that he is to be the new warden. That means he will have money. All of a sudden, all these people who thought you're poor, you're going to stay poor, and you've exhausted your credit, all of a sudden they're willing to do anything for him. Coming events cast their shadow before, and the coming event of Mr. Quiverful's transference to Barchester produced a delicious shadow in the shape of a new outfit for Mrs. Quiverful and her 3 elder daughters. Such consolations came home to the heart of a man, and quite home to the heart of a woman. Whatever the husband might feel, the wife cared nothing for frowns of dean, archdeacon, or prebendary. To her, the outsides and the insides of her husband and 14 children were everything. In her bosom, every other ambition had been swallowed up in that material ambition of seeing them and him and herself duly clad and properly fed. It had come to that with her that life now had no other purpose. She recked nothing of the imaginary rights of others. She had no patience with her husband when he declared that he could not accept the hospital unless he knew that Mr. Harding had refused it. Her husband had no right to be quixotic at the expense of 14 children. The narrow escape of throwing away his good fortune, which her lord had had, almost paralyzed her. Now, indeed, they had received the full promise not only from Mr. Slope, but also from Mrs. Proudie. Now, indeed, they might reckon with safety on their good fortune. But what if all had been lost? What if her 14 bairns and their had been re-steeped to the hips in poverty by the morbid sentimentality of their father? Mrs. Quiverful was just at present a happy woman, and yet it nearly took her breath away when she thought of the risk they had run. I don't know what your father means as he talks so much about what is due to Mr. Harding, she said to her eldest daughter. Does he think that Mr. Harding would give him £450 out of fine feeling? And what signifies it whom he offends as long as he gets the place? He doesn't expect anything better. It passes me to think how your father can be so soft while everybody around him is so griping. Thus, while the outer world was accusing Mr. Quiverful of rapacity for promotion and of disregard to his honor, the inner world of his own household was falling foul of him with equal vehemence for his willingness to sacrifice their interest to a false feeling of sentimental pride. It is astonishing how much difference the point of view makes in the aspect of all we look at. You think? Thanks, Tony. Such were the feelings of the different members of the family at Puddingdale on the occasion of Mr. Slope's second visit. Mrs. Quiverful, as she saw his horse coming up the avenue from the vicarage gate, hastily packed up her huge basket of needlework and hurried herself and her daughter out of the room in which she was sitting with her husband. It's Mr. Slope, she said. He's come to settle with you about the hospital. I do hope we shall now be able to move at once. And she hastened to bid the maid of all work go to the door, so as to welcome the great man might not be kept waiting. So they have a maid of all work. She gets almost nothing, but they have almost nothing. But still. Mr. Slope thus found Mr. Quiverful alone. Mrs. Quiverful went off to her kitchen and back settlements with an anxious beating heart, almost dreading that there might be some slip between the cup of her happiness and the lip of her fruition, and yet comforting herself with the reflection that after what had taken place, any such slip could hardly be possible. And here it comes. Mr. Slope was all smiles as he shook his brother clergyman's hand and said that he had ridden over because he thought it right at once to put Mr. Quiverful in possession of all the facts in the matter regarding the wardenship of the hospital. As he spoke, the poor expectant husband and father saw at a glance that his brilliant hopes were to be dashed to the ground, and that his visitor was now there for the purpose of unsaying what in his former visit he had said. There was something in the tone of voice, something in the glance of the eye, which told the tale. Mr. Quiverful knew it all at once. He maintained his self-possession, however, smiled with a slight unmeaning smile, and merely said that he was obliged to Mr. Slope for the trouble he was taking. Can you imagine? He sees it. He knows in a glance what has happened. And this is after everyone around him, not just his family, but tradesmen, have been acting as though this were a sure thing. He sees at a glance that it isn't. That Mr. Slope has come to renege on his offer. And he still manages to keep some degree of self-possession. I'm kind of liking this quiverful guy. It has been a troublesome matter from first to last, said Mr. Slope, and the bishop has hardly known how to act. Between ourselves, but mind, this of course must go no further, Mr. Quiverful. The truth is that poor Mr. Harding has hardly known his own mind. You remember our last conversation, no doubt. Mr. Quiverful assured him that he remembered it very well. You will remember that I told you that Mr. Harding had refused to return to the hospital. Mr. Quiverful declared that nothing could be more distinct in his memory. And acting on this refusal, I suggested that you should take the hospital, continued Mr. Slope. I understood you to say that the bishop had authorized you to offer it to me. Did I? Did I go so far as that? Well, perhaps it may be that in my anxiety on your behalf I did commit myself further than I should have done. So far as my own memory serves me, I don't think that I did go quite so far as that, but I own I was very anxious that you should get it, and I may have said more than was quite prudent. All so that he can win a widow. A husband, a wife, and 14 kids, also that he can win a widow. But, said Mr. Quiverful, in his deep anxiety to prove his case, my wife received as distinct a promise from Mrs. Proudie as one human being can give to another. Mr. Slope smiled and gently shook his head. He meant that smile for a pleasant smile, but it was diabolical in the eyes of the man he was speaking to. Mrs. Proudie, he said, if we are to go by what passes between the ladies in these matters, we shall be really in a nest of troubles from which we shall never extricate ourselves. Mrs. Proudie is a most excellent lady, kind-hearted, charitable, pious, and in every way estimable. But, my dear Mr. Quiverful, the patronage of the diocese is not in her hands. Mr. Quiverful for a moment sat panic-stricken and silent. Am I to understand, then, that I have received no promise? He said, as soon as he had sufficiently collected his thoughts. He certainly has. Which is why his family has put it about, and they have got new lines of credit, new clothing. If you will allow me, I will tell you exactly how the matter rests. You certainly did receive a promise conditional on Mr. Harding's refusal. I am sure you will do me the justice to remember that you yourself declared that you could accept the appointment on no other condition than the knowledge that Mr. Harding had declined it. Yes, said Mr. Quiverful, I did say that, certainly. Well, it now appears that he did not refuse it. But surely you told me, and repeated it more than once, that he had done so in your hearing. So I understood him, but it seems I was in error. But don't for a moment, Mr. Quiverful, suppose that I mean to throw you over. No, having held out my hand to a man in your position, with your large family and pressing claims, I am now not going to draw it back again. I only want you to act with me fairly and honestly. Whatever I do, I shall endeavor at any rate to act fairly, said the poor man, feeling that he had to fall back for support on the spirit of martyrdom within him. He is a martyr, though. This is just a horrible way to treat someone. I am sure you will, said the other. I am sure you have no wish to obtain possession of an income which belongs by right to another. No man knows better than you do Mr. Harding's history, or can better appreciate his character. Mr. Harding is very desirous of returning to his old position, and the bishop feels that he is at present moment somewhat hampered, though of course he is not bound by the conversation which took place on the matter between you and me. Well, said Mr. Quiverful, dreadfully doubtful as to what his conduct under such circumstances should be, and fruitlessly striving to harden his nerves with some of that instinct of self-preservation which made his wife so bold. Can you imagine what she would be saying if she were in the room right now? The wardenship of this little hospital is not the only thing in the bishop's gift, Mr. Quiverful, nor is it by many degrees the best. That his lordship is not the man to forget anyone whom he has marked with approval. If you would allow me to advise you as a friend, indeed I shall be most grateful to you, said the poor vicar of Puddingdale. I should advise you to withdraw from any opposition to Mr. Harding's claims. If you persist in your demand, I do not think you will ultimately succeed. Mr. Harding has all but a positive right to the place, but if you will allow him to inform the bishop that you decline to stand in Mr. Harding's way, I think I may promise you, though by the by it must not be taken as a formal promise, that the bishop will not allow you to be a poorer man than you would have been had you become warden. Mr. Quiverful sat in his armchair silent, gazing at vacancy. What was he to say? All this that came from Mr. Slope was so true. Mr. Harding had a right to the hospital. The bishop had a great many good things of his to give away. Both the bishop and Mr. Slope would be excellent friends and terrible enemies to a man in his position. And then he had no proof of any promise, could not force the bishop to appoint him. All of this is true. Well, Mr. Quiverful, what do you say about it? Oh, of course, whatever you think fit, Mr. Slope. It's a great disappointment, a very great disappointment. I won't deny that I'm a very poor man, Mr. Slope. In the end, Mr. Quiverful, you will find that it had been better for you. The interview ended, Mr. Slope receiving the full renunciation from Mr. Quiverful of any claim he might have to the appointment in question. It was only given verbally and without witnesses, but then the original promise had been made in the same way. Mr. Slope again assured him that he should not be forgotten, and then rode back to Barchester, satisfied that he would now be able to mold the bishop to his wishes. The bishop's wishes are that Mr. Quiverful get... There you go. That is the next chapter of Barchester Towers, where we see Mr. Slope in his element. He is lying to everyone. He's lying in all directions. Can't help but think with a novelist as worldly as Trollope, but also as moralizing as Trollope, that's going to come back to bite him. The bishop has instructed him to go over to Puddingdale and give the wardenship to Mr. Quiverful. The bishop's wife, Mrs. Proudie, expects it and has guaranteed it to Mrs. Quiverful. But Mr. Slope wants Eleanor Bold for his wife, so that won't do. And Mr. Quiverful has now full-throatedly declined the position because he has been lied to. So, the plot thickens. So there we go. Well, that is our chapter for today. I will wrap this up for now, and we will reconvene next time. Thank you, BookTube.